Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming back for our last panel, which is Total Reset 1 year on. As mentioned, this looks at 1 year after the mayor has declared a total reset for public and below market housing. Where are we and where do we need to go? So I'd like to invite to the podium our moderator, Carlton Brown. You may know him because he's a visiting assistant professor here at Pratt, and he's also Chief Operating Officer at Full Spectrum Development. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say a few words, very few words, because we're tight on time before I bring the panel up. But one of the things, after 1 year, a new mayor, a new plan, a new vision, what does it all mean? I think the important thing to keep in mind is the context of what a new plan means in the context of New York. New York is a place that is fast becoming a mega city. It's a place where it's growing in ways it's never grown before. It's growing at one end of the barbell in terms of immigrant families, lower income families. There are existing stakeholders that have been challenged in communities, and a lot of contested communities. What does the rezoning, what does public housing mean in these contested communities, and what does it mean for the different type household formations? So as we start to think about this, there are public space implications, there are infrastructure implications, there are housing typology implications. So what does the new plan do for us going forward? So panel, can you join us?
Pardon. Well, the panelists approach, I just have a quick announcement, housekeeping. EJ Song had 3 beautiful books outside, and there's 1 missing. So if you've borrowed number 2 of her books, please find me or her after the program. Thank you.
This is some panel. And I've been told we don't need to really introduce people or tell you about their bios because they're all in the book, so we'll just start. Quentin?
Hello everyone, my name is Killian Riano. I am an architect and I teach here at Pratt. I've taught with Ron Schiffman and David Burney and Michaela Crater. We taught a studio looking at the Rockaways, and I teach at the School of Design Strategies. My practice and studio has been trying to work looking at housing, but really as an excuse to create larger systems. Always thinking about what are some of the things that we can play with and then do housing design out of it. I wanted to show you 2 precedents to things that, to the approach that I've been taking and some of the things that were coming together for the fellowship. And number 1 was a housing project in Nicaragua, in Granada, Nicaragua. This is a collaboration with Teddy Cruz Studio, in which we began to look at the resources that were available, in this case, trees, and began to create an extremely flexible and shareable system in which all the houses came within, including spaces that would be able to grow over time. One of the interesting things about this project, however, it was the first thing that we did was have an engagement in which people wanted skills and jobs. That's really one of the things that people wanted. So one of the first things that we did is through David Deutsch and the Park Foundation, we got a couple of tractors and created a business as the beginning to a locally run business that would then construct the housing itself and that would support it over time. Then in Colombia, we did a very similar thing with meetings in which we designed housing, but what we were really trying to do here is beginning to play with the loan system in Colombia, in the subsidy system. We looked at how much money was being allocated by the Colombian government for each individual house. We noticed that the Colombian government usually gave half of the house as a subsidy, a quarter of it as a savings that the family itself would have to have, and then a quarter of it as loans. We then thought about, what about if we begin to use the design of the housing itself as a way to collectivize those loans and then create economic opportunity, and that the housing itself would then be all about that. So now a little bit into the work that we've done in here in New York, and I like to begin with this image, because the image of the microhousing becomes one in which, yes, there are open spaces, there are things, but it really misses the larger network of systems that need to happen in order for housing to be affordable, and affordable to whom, and all those questions. So the question here is really to begin to think outside of the unit, to come back to the unit and think about it. So I've taken a lot of inspiration from groups like Organizing for Occupation, a group that already ended, but started about in 2011, that did blockades, groups like Community Land Trust, that are beginning to think about housing in a new way. So we've talked a lot about some of the processes by which public and private entities are going into housing. One of the things that is very interesting is that a lot of groups are organizing themselves to create these new kind of structures that would allow for these communities themselves to own that land through help with the city. So in this case, this is some of the drawings and information from Nicely, created by Parsons students. So just my project itself over the fellowship was something that I called Share What. And the question was looking at what are the type of spaces and things that we're already sharing, and how can we use those to design. We did a series of engagement projects and processes, and looking at precedents from the past. This is the Finnish co-op. We looked at the current community land trust and these new kind of what maybe I'll call a little bit of software groups, such as community land trust and tenants unions that are beginning to push back against housing. We are doing a series of these type of diagrams that explain those systems, and then we did engagement. But the real question here is this, is how has the NYCHA been defunded over time, and how can we help it? The last part of this project that's not here yet is how do we then bring it into a project. We were gonna work on it over time, but right now I've been also interested that to look at some of the empty commercial spaces, especially around Williamsburg and some of the housing there, to think about what are the jobs and similar to those projects in Latin America to bring in there. Thank you.
Kaya?
Just a second, let's go to the beginning. Getting a little preview. Oops, no, sorry. Possible view.
Hi, so my name is Kaya Kuhl. I am the coordinator of a graduate urban design studio at Columbia University called the Five Borough Studio that takes place every summer. It's the first semester for graduate students from all over the world. And I'm part of a team of about 7 faculty members and 50 students. And this work that I'm showing you is what we as a team did last summer as part of this fellowship at the IPA. We were interested in the notion of affordable housing. What we do is we go into 5 neighborhoods every year, 1 in each borough, and we pick a topic that's essentially on the front page of the New York Times in that year, so affordable housing was very much that. But we wanted to start a conversation with residents of these neighborhoods about housing in a way where we ask an open question of what is home, and if you would send a postcard from your home, what would it say about that? And I'm just going to show, so we collected these postcards over the course of the summer, also in the space that we were working at or exhibiting at up in Harlem. to a growing exhibition of, at the end, 500 postcards from home. And a couple of themes came out of this. Home is where the body waits for the heart is one of my favorites, very abstract and not spatial. But we also tried to sort of collect answers that said something about the space in which people live and what they value in these spaces. So New York City was an obvious answer with all its stress and miseries, also excitement about the city. Home as neighborhood and community is something that we heard a lot about. Home is friends and family. Home is very much defined by the people around us. Home is comfort and safety. And also privacy. However, it was actually surprising that there were very few answers about the actual apartments in which people live as a definition of home. Home is food is something that we heard a lot, and also especially from people for whom home is actually elsewhere, that food is sort of the notion that brings home to us in New York City. And then one thing that we heard often when we ask about, how could your home be different is home should be affordable, and currently it's not. And like I said, this was a growing exhibition. Here you see some impressions of how these postcards began to fill the room, and they also began to fill our minds. And what for the students and us as a team this then led into was design projects that we developed over the summer, and I'm just going to show a few to give you an impression of what values we took away from this process of asking residents this open-ended question. So here's an example of forest houses in the Bronx. Morrisania was one of our neighborhoods, and this team of students looked at all the schools that surround this NYCHA campus and the kinds of things that some of these schools don't have and might benefit from if they could share it, like a gymnasium, art rooms, computer labs, auditoriums, or libraries, or outdoor spaces like playgrounds and green spaces. And what if they would share that actually in the middle of their locations, which was the grounds of this NYCHA campus, and would in doing that, be able to not only create a shared space for the students of these schools, but also a shared space for the residents and activate these spaces in that way. Another example is something that we heard in earlier panels. This is an idea of membership instead of ownership, the East New York Food Club, that tried to look at how we can make the best use of a lot of small vacant lots in East New York by essentially creating a nonprofit cooperative where community members have a membership and through this membership have access to catalyst spaces such as a community center, a kitchen incubator, and a food co-op, and that over time from these catalyst spaces the group would begin to develop housing on top of that in addition to these catalyst spaces, and the membership would grow, allowing access to a number of resources in the community without actually having to own something other than your membership card. Here's just a sort of rendering of what a street filled of this growing resource in the neighborhood would look like. And here's one last one that was actually done a couple years past. We have, we often have groups that are interested and sort of focus on NYCHA campuses in the middle of their neighborhood. So this was a group looking at Farragut houses and at how it's situated in the Brooklyn Tech Triangle, where there is a known need for more office space in the tech community that's been settling there between Dumbo, downtown Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn Navy Yards. And this group looked at opportunities of how this could actually bring outsiders in and insiders out, was sort of the term they phrased as a way of bringing businesses and jobs into the NYCHA campus and using that for more affordable housing within the campus. So these are sort of some keywords that come out of our projects every summer in this process that are very much about how do you integrate different players and different resources into this question of affordable housing. Thank you.
would say good afternoon. I'm Sagi Golan, Miriam Pedersen, and Nathan Rich. Thank you, the IPA, for supporting our project during the summer. So we'll delve right into the proposal that we developed over the summer, the 9x18. So first of all, what is the 9x18? 9x18 is the size of a typical parking space. 9x18 is also very valuable land. 9x18 is a burden to stakeholders, but it's also a commodity. But I think we really believe that in the end, the 9x18 project is all about lifestyle choices. So we've talked about the mayor affordable housing plan quite a lot and about numbers, but here like a very high-profile project that was developed, proposed recently that seeks to develop 50 affordable housing units. If we put it into perspective of the 200 affordable housing units that we want to preserve and construct, we'll probably need 1,600 projects like these, each one with its own process to achieve this goal. So it's quite clear that a strategic citywide approach is critical here. So going back to the parking, and here are some facts that got us going and coming to an additional conclusion. So when current regulations require that an average of 1 parking space to be built for every 3 newly constructed units, and 84% of New Yorkers use their cars only for household chores. And since 2007, 88% of new development have been constructed within half a mile of a subway stop. It is clear to us that parking could be an agent of change.
So as part of our fellowship over the summer up at the Sugar Hill Houses, sponsored by the IPA, we had a chance to engage different kinds of stakeholders, developers, city officials, local residents, other designers, planners, in this conversation to help us come up with some ideas for how parking policy and parking space could relate to the development of more affordable housing. And so we started with the inner ring neighborhoods, which are defined by the Department of City Planning and which are actually coming up a tremendous amount in some of the new language that the City Planning Department is drafting related to affordable housing. They're the neighborhoods shown here in gray, outside of the Manhattan core. In blue are New York City Housing Authority sites. So what this diagram shows is sort of the sort of unbelievable reach and area that NYCHA has citywide, particularly in the inner ring. The tags in red indicate area of surface level parking. So there's a tremendous amount on NYCHA sites. There's a tremendous amount of it. In Brownsville alone, there's more than 1 million square feet of surface level parking. Taken all together citywide, there is 20,360,000 square feet of surface level parking on NYCHA land in the inner ring. So we like to say that that's almost 2/3 the size of Central Park, and it's more than enough land, we would say, to develop 80,000 new affordable units, which is what the mayor has set out within his 200,000 affordable units citywide. So NYCHA typologies in this audience, I think, are probably very familiar. A single building type, often deployed in a geometric pattern on a superblock site. One of the things that our analysis showed, though, is that the parking lots themselves also have typological characteristics. So often they'll show up on the corner of a site. We've identified a couple of other types, cul-de-sac. The through block in particular was really stood out to us because these are places where the city grid stops and hits the superblock site, and rather than the street continuing through the NYCHA development, you get an enormous parking lot. One of the other things that our research showed is that the 9x18 dimension, the name of our project, is particularly conducive to residential housing development. So we laid out some simple unit types, the micro unit, the 1 bedroom, and the 2 bedroom, based on the 9x18 grid. So taken together, the idea that the unit itself relates to a parking space, that there is ample surface level parking on NYCHA sites citywide. The idea here is that there's the potential for a replicable strategy that we could deploy across these sites citywide, or at least an idea about deploying something citywide. So when you look at some of the sites themselves, in yellow on these maps are NYCHA sites. In red, what you're seeing are the surface level lots. On the left is East Harlem, in the middle is the Lower East Side, and the right is the Broadway Triangle in Brooklyn. It shows just how much surface level parking there is on the NYCHA sites relative to the standard, more typical urban fabric.
Over the course of the summer, we looked more closely at East Harlem, which was particularly interesting given its proximity to the Manhattan core. Also, statistically, only 84% of households in East Harlem don't own a car, and only 12% of households commute to work using an automobile. So we asked ourselves, what if we sort of consolidated all of this surface-level parking on NYCHA sites and then redistributed them in strategic locations within the neighborhood? That would free up 90% of the area on NYCHA sites in East Harlem for other uses. So that's 600,000 plus square feet in this particular instance. These new parking hubs would not just be sort of typical garages, but they would have active bases and rooftop recreation, and they would really serve as community hubs. In addition, we proposed a sort of more fine-grained approach to parking policy, which would take into consideration the size of a unit, the proximity to transit, and then the level of affordability. We are happy to see that actually the city is proposing reform to the existing zoning right now that does take into consideration some of these issues, not only on new projects, but actually they're proposing, from how I understand it, opportunities for reevaluating existing developments to reduce the existing parking on those sites for potential other uses as well. Within the parking district, new construction could also pay into a parking fund to house their parking requirement, now reduced, in our parking hubs. In East Harlem, this is particularly valuable because the water table is high and it makes constructing below-grade parking very expensive and sometimes prohibitively so. So on the neighborhood scale, we promote an active lifestyle and produce opportunities for community amenities. This is an example of one of these 3-block lots before, and you guys have been looking at this image more or less all day, but re-envisioned strategic infill developments on these sites provide opportunities for more affordable housing, for much needed cultural and community amenities and resident services. They also provide opportunities of reintroducing streets and niching NYCHA campuses into their communities. Just a little bit about what we've been doing with the project since the fellowship over the summer. We had an opportunity to present it at the Municipal Art Society this fall. And we've raised a little bit of money through IOBI to sort of begin a community outreach day sometime in the summer. We also had an opportunity through the IPA to present the project to some NYCHA GED students through the Henry Street settlement. And I'm happy to say that all of the residents were very engaged in the idea and more or less were happy and willing to begin talking about trading a parking space for something else in their community that they value more than that area. And then at the upcoming Fit City 10 conference, we're going to be working together with ENIAD Architects and NYCHA, among other design firms, both architecture and landscape, to do a series of workshops studying the Betances houses in the Bronx. So those are things that we're doing next. That's it.
Right. It is.
So I'm Frederick Bealey. I'm very happy to be included with the IPA Fellows. I'm going to be presenting the work of my 4th-year undergraduate studio here at Pratt, which began with this premise. The national failure of post-war low-income housing is equally an architectural failure. The systemic application of a high-rise in the park typology can now be defined as fundamentally anti-urban. But the scale of its achievement, its population's lack of political leverage, have allowed its destructive presence to languish, at least until now. Whether for the potential to extract revenue from the superblock's excess of open space, or the need for massive restoration after having passed their 50-year warranted lifespan, interest in finally doing something to address the anomaly of the public housing superblock has arrived. So undergraduate architecture addressed this issue with a studio called Reinventing Public Housing. It examined ways that superblock housing could be recuperated urbanistically, recontextualized, so as to become a vital interconnected part of the living city. The site selected was the Ingersoll Whitman houses in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. I assume most of you know the site, so I'm not going to say anything more about it, other than that it can easily be understood as prototypical. The students worked in teams, and each of them was asked to address 3 critical issues. First was the restoration of the idea of the street. The superblock site eliminated not only the actual streets of Brooklyn's historic gridiron, but the very idea of the street as something that is present in sections spatially. Subdividing the superblock again so as to introduce a more porous vehicular and pedestrian circulation system was the first step. Those are there's your existing condition at the top and the 6 projects I'm showing below. Second was the reshaping of the urban fabric in relationship to those streets. With the existing buildings, we quite intentionally chose not to respect a 60-foot setback, which might be typical for appropriate access to light and air. Thus, the lower floors had to be incorporated into the physical changes being proposed. Displaced residential units were required to be replaced in another location within the project. This was really the tactical decision that opened the studio up to concepts not previously considered, and to our thinking is the real invention, or pathway to invention. It's also why the pattern of the existing towers, which you see at the top, really completely disappears into the various projects. The third step was to delineate the newly defined territories of public space, semi-public space, and private space. When the superblock took away the street, it also removed the conventional understanding of the separation between public and private realms. Reintegration with the fabric had to reintroduce the more familiar clues to spatial usage. A critical part of this was also in addressing the absolute sameness and banality of the existing buildings. With these 3 prioritized issues, the students proposed 6 different ideas to recontextualize the superblock housing estate. So the first one was called the Knicker Block Scheme, which was named after their precedent study due to its shared attributes. It is a variation on the perimeter block housing type. It takes the existing low-income towers and clusters them into more comprehensible units of between 2 and 6 buildings. The new vehicular streets are introduced running north and south to further break up the block, while a green pedestrian promenade runs east and west. The clustering is achieved by adding a 2-story base that connects the existing towers together, offering street front commercial space and semi-private interior courtyards for the residents. The hyperblock scheme is also a perimeter block variation, clustering together the existing towers into different but also more manageable blocks around semi-private interior courtyards. It also quite consciously creates a series of public courtyards that help to organize the clustering as well as reinforce the distribution of new and existing institutional programs. The school that's there, a museum is proposed. There's also a skating rink, as well as more retail, commercial, and localized service programs attuned to the specific neighborhood. The microblock scheme is quite interesting because it pushes this notion of the perimeter block to excess by allowing each of the existing buildings to determine its own individual block. The street system, by being simultaneously superporous but also discontinuous, becomes self-regulating, appropriate for a residential neighborhood. Its urban scale is perhaps its most determined invention, where a surrounding two-story apron of typically non-residential program would fill each of the small sites. The metastasized block scheme doubles the existing number of housing units by connecting the existing towers to one another around what appear to be closed courtyards. The character of the site shifts from objects in a field to a maze of interior spaces. However, the lower floors contradict this, as they have been removed to allow for a meandering ground plane punctuated by the residential entrance pavilions. Colliding Typologies seeks to thread back onto the site the eliminated north-south through streets, which of course can now only do so by twisting the knife, so to speak. They then reinforce the new streets with three different housing types: a typical townhouse, a double-faced townhouse, actually as in the Borinquen Plaza project we saw yesterday, and a courtyard type. These are the diagrams showing the kind of interface between the two systems. And the figure ground of the results suggests that by cross-fertilizing the two systems, there is really quite a rich variety of easily programmable public, semi-public, and ultimately private spaces. The last scheme looked to preserve the existing open space landscape, but this time as a form of landscape urbanism, using its section to shape the separation between public and private conditions. The green surfaces slope down to allow easy access, and up to tuck underneath it commercial, recreational, and necessary social programs. What I think was really quite surprising to me with the studio was how many really quite successful projects there were, that there's so much of it really did seem to work in my mind. So with that, thank you very much.
Second slide. Okay. Brenda Liz and Santiago.
First Houses is one of the first housing projects built in the United States. The tenement is in the Lower East Side in Manhattan, New York. The first development the first houses was on December 3rd of 1935, and were designated in New York City and National History Landmark in 1974. They are managed by the New York City Housing Authority. The public housing project consists of 8 buildings with 126 units and 3 to 5-story walk-ups. It also has 5 storefronts. Before First Houses was created, Victorian-era tenements existed on the site before they were cleared to build First Houses project, which was completed in 1936. The project was planned as a grud rehab with Everlight and air. But architect Frederick L. Ackerman and his engineers soon discovered that the 19th century tenement was too fragile to be reconstructed. So they were torn down, and First Houses was built from scratch. The project employed reused bricks and dozens of works on relief pad of the federal government. Ackerman designed the buildings with rear entrances and courtyards to allow more light and air than the existing tenements in the neighborhood, and the crowd open areas behind the buildings provided playgrounds, trees, benches, sculptures for the tenants. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, cut the ceremony ribbon of the landmark opening of first public housing development in the United States. New York State government, Herbert H. Elman, at the far right, and New York City Mayor LaGuardia at the right, stand beside her during her historical moment. The New York City Housing Authority provides opportunity to low and moderate income to New Yorkers in New York, and that's great. Now, the lack of living conditions residents are currently facing is unacceptable. As the prior RA president of First Houses, NYCHA doesn't communicate resident leaders of policy changes and any plans until after the policy and plans are a done deal. Resident leaders are supposed to inform tenants of current situations, and NYCHA not communicating shows that NYCHA doesn't care of tenants' input during issues. Residents are the ones living with this condition in their homes, and we vote too as NYCHA tenants. All we ask is to work and involve the community community residents on plans made and to build the relationship to help preserve NYCHA developments as a whole, and any changes made affect us all. As a long NYCHA resident of the community of the Lower East Side, I've been working closely with New York City Housing Authority, and the lack of communication is the key of improvement. I have recently been working with Lower East Side Rehab, East 4th Street, a Section 8 development in the Lower East Side. They are one of the 6 NYCHA developments that are affected on the markup to market rate plan, which is is also known as the 50-50 plan. It consists, the building consists of 24 units, 2 buildings, as you can see, 24 units and 6-story walk-up. I have taken the initiative to reach out to residents of Lower East Side Rehab on the new plan and to meet the resident association leader before the development, but the development didn't have a resident association and weren't acknowledged of the plan, market rate, until the New Year's Eve of 2014 by receiving a letter in the mail on the building being managed by private contractors. The other 5 were informed, and Rehab was not informed at all, and as a community advocate, I don't think that's right. I'm helping residents form a resident association at Lower East Side Rehab to engage community engagement to show that the unity, within unity is power. By working with our community leaders and elected officials, helped Rehab stay involved and have more knowledge of the plan moving forward. Excuse me. So the picture on the left is how Lower East Side Rehab Group 4 on the Lower East Side is going to look after the plan. And then the next slide, that's Compost Plaza, also located in the Lower East Side Rehab, how they presently look now under NYCHA. And this is how it's going to look after the plan, the market up to market. Currently, First Houses actually just reached its 80th anniversary this year. And we also are currently suffering of groundworks in the courtyards, maintenance because of lack of funds, and now the NYCHA has 100 million and now 400 million for the next 10 years, so we can move forward to preserve public housing as a whole. And to thank the community leaders for supporting and putting pressure to help save New York City Housing Authority. Thank you.
Karina?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karina Tota, and I am Senior Advisor to the Chair at the New York City Housing Authority. It is great to be here today. The Institute for Public Architecture has been a strong supporter and engager of the New York City Housing Authority over the last year, as have many other members of the design community that are here today and others who are not. So thank you for having us. Today I'd like to talk to you about Next Generation NYCHA. When the mayor appointed Chair Shola Olatoye to the post to head the New York City Housing Authority, he gave her two very clear directions. One, reset your relationship with key stakeholders, and two, put forth a plan for how you're going to make public housing survive into the next generation. And so, over the last year, we have been engaged in a process that we have coined Next Generation NYCHA to try to address some of the fundamental ways in which we must change how we're operated, how we're financed, how we rebuild ourselves, and how we engage our residents so that we can ensure the preservation of public housing moving forward. The vision that drives Next Generation NYCHA is one that we have formed clearly through our listening and our engagement over the last year. It's something that everybody in this room wants for their homes and their families, which is safe, clean, and connected. In order to drive towards that vision, we have laid out 4 goals. The first is to achieve short-term financial stability and long-term financial diversification. The second is focused on our operations. We are first and foremost a landlord. We are the largest residential landlord in New York City with 178,000 units, 2,550 buildings, and over 328 developments. To rebuild, how can we rehabilitate and harness our assets to make sure that they are not aging and deteriorating, and that our residents deserve the best conditions and improved conditions, and how can we get there, given years of federal disinvestment? And lastly, how can we better engage residents? Speaking to Ms. Santiago's points, how can we listen better? How can we communicate better? And how can we bring in residents' voices to different parts of how we're making decisions across the authority? It's going to take time. We did not get to this situation overnight. Federal disinvestment began in the late 1990s, and many mistakes have been made. There have been successes, but also mistakes. So as we try to move towards Next Generation NYCHA, it will take time. But we started. One of the places that we started is in Ingersoll houses. Starting last summer, working with our community organizing partners, New York Communities for Change, we began outreach in 3 communities across the city: Ingersoll houses, Millbrook houses in the South Bronx, and Van Dyke houses in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to try to pilot a new approach to resident engagement and to visioning the future of communities. The outreach and the organizing that took place over July and August led to a series of 3 community visioning sessions in September. Through those sessions, residents worked to identify the priorities for their developments and where they wanted to focus in their community vision. And since then, there has been, and this is just a schedule for you, once the community vision plans were put together to reflect those priorities, we then have launched into a series of meetings to work on the implementation of those plans. So these are some examples from the community visioning exercises that took place in September at Ingersoll houses. Very familiar to some people in this room, sort of partly charrette and partly prioritization exercises throughout the visioning sessions. Here at Ingersoll, you can see that strong places were mapped as the parks and the library, that's number 3. But then when it came to weak places, challenges around security, dark alleyways, a neighboring homeless shelter where there's loitering, underpass of the BQE, and also insufficient or inappropriate retail in the neighborhood along Myrtle Avenue. We also did some real-time surveying to understand how priorities were falling out. And these are the results of those real-time surveying in terms of residents' priorities. These were the 6 priorities they had identified, and then the further prioritization. Safety and security was at the top at Ingersoll, and it was at the top at every single development. And this is further surveying. In October, the results of these visioning sessions were released in vision plans. And then we began with a call to action to implement those plans, making it very clear that the NYCHA model of 80 years, where we have been a self-contained, sprawling, direct service entity, was not a viable way for us to continue for another 80 years. And so the implementation of the vision plans has really been an effort of the community, of the residents, and of NYCHA. The community partners that we have been working with have been extensive here in Ingersoll. This is just a list of some of them. Everything from the Navy Yard to the NYPD to the Myrtle Avenue Brooklyn Partnership. The community has really come out, because I think this has been an exercise not only of how do we plan for our community and create a more safe and secure community and bring in more affordable housing, but also how do we develop the capacity to work together in this new format and in this new partnership model. Since November, there has been progress on all fronts of the priorities where we have been working at Ingersoll houses. Resident Watch has increased. There are RFPs that are soon to be released for affordable housing, and there was a very clear need for Ingersoll expressed for particularly lower income affordable housing development in a neighborhood that has so rapidly gentrified. On maintenance and repairs, we have begun more communication between the property managers and the residents involved in maintenance and repairs on that committee for the vision plan to increase communication there so that we can be more responsive. Our Resident Economic and Empowerment Sustainability Group, which is what we like to call one of NYCHA's best kept secrets, which connects residents to employment opportunities, is working closely with Brooklyn Workforce Initiatives and the BNYC Youth Mentor Program collaboration to do an event on June 1st. And one of our residents who started saying how the supermarket wasn't delivering, didn't have delivery for seniors. First she went and negotiated free delivery for seniors on Tuesdays. Then she came back the next month and said, I negotiated free delivery for seniors every day of the week. And the next month she came back and she said, I negotiated free delivery for everybody every day of the week. And so the great energy and movement and initiative that has been on display has been really amazing. We still have a long way to go. We've been working closely with the Tenant Association president there, Mr. Anthony Sosa, who has been a key part of this, and we will continue to work together, as well as playground improvements with a cleanup day scheduled for next weekend, as well as an assessment of all of the playground and park spaces nearby. So it's really also been a capacity building effort for NYCHA. We're learning a new way to do resident engagement. For the residents is a new way to set short-term goals, follow-up tasks, working and expecting different things from NYCHA, and also our community partners coming into the developments and becoming stronger partners with us, and us being easier and better to work with. So that's where we're headed with Next Generation NYCHA. The plan is going to be released in a few weeks, so you can look out for that. But Next Generation NYCHA is a process, and it started a year ago, and it will continue. And many of the people in this room, my NYCHA colleagues, the design community that's present, advocates, resident leaders, have been involved in helping to form this plan and will be crucial in helping to implement it and help it evolve as it goes forward. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity, for these great ideas. We have listened, we are trying to, we have heard, and we are trying to bring in as much of the good ideas as possible. And we hope that working together with you, we can get to these safe, clean, and connected communities that we aspire to. So thank you.
Okay, that was wonderful. I have just a couple things that just noticed, right? There's been a lot of talk about physical form and et cetera, but it seems like a lot of this discussion was about social integration. It was about deconstructing barriers, you know, between residents of public housing and the rest of the community. And we heard some approaches that talked about sort of conceptually rebuilding, but in the absence of deconstructing buildings, how do we reconstruct communities so that they are engaged and not isolated? Any ideas?
I don't know if you can hear me. Well, I feel that that maybe reaching out, going out to the communities. It could be organizers from the community, community advocates in general, probably doing a survey and finding out why residents don't get engaged. Because I think that's a big question that needs to be said and addressed to the community, and that's every community. Because at the end, I feel that every development in the communities have the same issues. We just handle or we see things differently. We express our feelings differently. Because after a while, you know, it's frustrating to live and be around, you know, the same situations. When unity is, like I said before, it's power, but it's also trust, and also communication is the key as well.
One of the things that I heard, you know, in one of the presentations when people asked, what is home? They didn't talk about the building. They talked about the neighborhood. They talked about food security. They talked about security. So the discussion about home is a lot more than just buildings. And I think when I look at sort of dense super blocks, and then I think about some of the mega cities in South America where they built these dense super blocks and the sort of social malaise that they came and different approaches toward deconstructing that. When we talk about this, there was one presentation that said, well, maybe we can think about doing something with these 20 million square feet, which was just kind of amazing, a parking lots, right? But beyond housing, what are the things that need to be added to this to make this these more viable communities?
So I would, to sort of combine answers to both of your questions about integration and viable communities, I think it's the connected part of safe, clean, and connected has three parts. It's a physical connection, and I think there has been, you know, we've seen some great examples of that today. How does the street grid interact with the developments? How can developments turn more outwards? How can ground floors be activated so that there is a clear physical connection between NYCHA and the surrounding communities? I think there's a service connection. As I mentioned, NYCHA for 80 years has been a direct service provider, and we are not funded to do that work, especially with our decreased funding. We have been limited in the scope and innovation of what we can do, and we haven't necessarily done the best job of engaging residents. And our path forward does involve better partnerships and a clear partnership model so that our residents can be connected to the services and programs that they need that exist in the thriving community-based organizations and the sector within New York City. So I think there's a service connection as the second part. And the third part is really a connection between NYCHA and New York City. That we are not a standalone city on our own, that we are the original affordable housing, and that to bring NYCHA and its challenges and its successes into the larger discussion of New York City affordable housing, into the larger discussion of New York City's future as a city, is really a key part of connecting NYCHA and creating viable communities. So, I think today is one step towards that, but it's a physical connection, it's a service connection, and it's a connection to the larger city.
One of the things I certainly commend the mayor and the administration about starting that change. I have a nightmare story from probably 15 years ago when we were doing some work for NYCHA at Cary Gardens in Albany, and we were supposed to engage residents, and the resident manager from Albany Houses says, absolutely not. I don't care what your contract says. I don't want these people to be engaged in making decisions here. And so when you've had a long history of that, for residents have been there, some for generations, right? The real challenge, from an institutional standpoint, is what do you do to send out the message that it's a new day? And so part of that, I think, is like new things, like jobs. One of the things that was supposed to happen before, when work was done in public housing, you were supposed to create jobs for residents. That very seldom happened. One of the presentations here talked about reintegration and creating jobs. What are some strategies that you would suggest that NYCHA residents and engaging the private sector to create jobs in public housing? Because part of it is reintegrating from an economic standpoint also. No ideas?
I'm not sure that we're, fully equipped to answer a question, that talks about job creation. But, one of the things that was sort of our interest in the 9x18 project was talking about, a physical space, a parking space that exists in someone's backyard and becomes an actual real thing that can be a part of a conversation and a discussion about trading. So I think job creation is obviously and arguably an important element in any community where you're going to be proposing to develop on top of a parking space or any other area on a NYCHA campus. But if you can sort of trade one thing for another thing that is of value, maybe it's a community garden, maybe not every NYCHA campus needs a community garden, but they want a dog run, or maybe they want a supermarket that sells food that's actually affordable for them because the rest of the neighborhood is developed to the point where there's not an affordable supermarket. Building that supermarket also has the potential to create jobs for residents. So it's, I think it's more complicated. I don't know how to answer the question about jobs specifically, but I think if you think about developing a campus within a community, then the elements that are built into that development service the community in a specific way that serves their needs and everyone else's needs around them. So it's all integrated.
Can I just add that one of the things potentially is that when we're talking about jobs, we're also talking about skill and skill gathering. So probably one of the things, and for here maybe could be to begin to add to understand what are the skills that as the tech and other groups are coming in, what are skills that are needed? Which ones could residents of NYCHA housing actually fulfill, and is there training needed? That was, for example, it's something that the Sustainable South Bronx was able to do very well, which is to understand where the economy was going and begin to really provide that training. Similarly, I heard, I was at a presentation not that long ago with the current and the past EDC chairs, and they were both talking about that in this drive towards housing and affordable housing, we're beginning to forget, first of all, in many ways, developers have an incentive to really just create nothing but housing, and that light industrial or these other uses that could be added have been ignored. So, for example, they were shooting around ideas about what are the type of warehouse spaces or the light industrial spaces. What could be typologies that could combine some of these new kind of spaces of making that could also potentially create jobs for the people around it. So their argument, it was interesting, especially because it was a little bit of both a little bit of critique of the total reset, and that the total reset needs extra things in order for it to work.
Yes.
If I can add, I think there is something interesting about this discussion that is kind of formulating here, is that there is a need to build initial trust of change, and this thing could be done in very simple ways, it's almost too simple for like designers to think about, clean and trash collection as something that is valuable, but it's super valuable to start this initial trust and to see that change is happening in these very, very basic needs. And I think after you've done that and you built that initial trust, then you could start talking about something of the bigger ideas that we're talking about. It's all about the time aspect and the phasing aspect, and I think that's what's interesting about this discussion, is that the meaning of home is like, what is to live in a NYCHA campus, what is to live in the apartment, what is the amenities that you need right now, and what could be there in the future. And I think that's kind of the discussion that NYCHA is starting to have, and then it's important for us to bring our ideas forward, but in time. I think that's the overall understanding that we need time for this process.
One of the things I find interesting, especially when I think about Ingersoll houses, just a few blocks away, maker spaces are being created. But maker spaces aren't being created with the intention of pulling in residents of public housing. Some of this 20 million square feet of parking lot, maybe we need to start to think about things like maker spaces, right, and those sort of things, because so frequently when I hear the dialogue about public housing, it's isolated from the dialogue about the rest of the community, right? And so we talk about maker spaces, people making chocolate, people making food, things that you really don't have to have a PhD to do, right? But I never hear that conversation brought back into public housing. How do we bring that back and make that part of the dialogue as well as part of the plan?
I think one of the things we learned through some of our discussions over the summer is there's an existing richness in a lot of the NYCHA developments where people are often working out of their own homes. Okay. And one of the thoughts that we've sort of discussed with people over the course of the process is how could maybe you use new development to bring some of those people who are working from home, maybe bring it out, make it more public, create opportunities for people who are working from home to actually engage maybe at the ground floor with some of the surrounding communities, and also give people space to actually do their work that's outside of their homes.
Just to add on to that, the Reese group that I mentioned at NYCHA has a NYCHApreneurs program, and recently graduated their first class of, I think it was 30 or so food entrepreneurs in a food business pathways program, with also giving them access to incubator space as well to get their businesses going.
Can I ask, are there other similar groups of people doing things? Because that's really fascinating, and it goes back a little bit to the first example, that it's not enough to engage by just saying we talked to them and they said they like it or they don't, but rather it seems like there was an organized group of people making food that then NYCHA could come in and help. And I'm wondering if that type of research into other kinds of skills, jobs, things that people are doing is being done.
Yes, I mean, our Reese group does a lot of surveying and information gathering to try to understand what's there, and I think that's how the NYCHApreneurs program got started, is the acknowledgement there are a lot of people who are running businesses out of their apartments, so let's see how we can help grow this. One of the things that we can do better is communicate with our residents, and another thing we could do better is communicate what we do well, and we're trying to do that, so hopefully this is an example.
One of the things, someone mentioned the Bronx, right? I was talking to someone, Majora Carter, in the South Bronx, and she started a game testing business there. and she's basically taken low-income residents from the Hunts Point area, and they've actually got contracts to test games. All these kids play video games. So sometimes the things that they value in the neighborhood, we have to sort of deconstruct that sort of model of I'm going to build a car, right? But what are the other things? Because I think that just from casual conversations I've heard with residents of public housing about the things that they are doing anyhow, right? But how can they be turned into commerce and supported on a broader basis? And I think, I'm not sure, but I think there are opportunities for this sort of intersection of philanthropy, private investment, and public investment to create these sort of opportunities that neither of these three things could do together. So I think one of the things that as planners and architects and developers and academics and managers, we have to start to think about where do we go from here and how do we really make these places where people live part of the 21st century for New York City, as opposed to really trying to get them caught up to what was appropriate 20 years ago. And I think that's a big challenge. Questions from the audience?
Pat Simon, who runs a public housing training program out in the Rockaways, has been talking about identifying all of the cottage industries that are taking place in those buildings and then trying to find some sort of venture capital or Axion micro-lending program to enable those cottage industries to flourish. But one of the things that public housing has to do first is to signal that doing non-hazardous production in public housing is no longer illegal, because people are going to hide what they're doing until you let them feel safe in what they're doing. And years ago in Williamsburg, they did identify a whole bunch, and I think Axion decided to do their first micro-lending in the United States based on people in public housing that were doing things. And so I think the idea around that is really one that needs nurturing and also needs some removal of at least the anxiety level that governs that in some public housing. And I think the other thing that we really have to do is to begin to invest in looking at how we bring new technologies into public housing. And your partner, Bruce Lincoln, has done a lot of that in terms of new technologies, and I think it's important. But when we worked with Gowanus Houses, the most important complaint we heard from them was the amount of money they're now having to pay for access to television and internet connections. And this is real money back into the pockets of residents there. And if we then pick up what the Red Hook Initiative is doing in terms of teaching young people how to install, mesh networks and communication networks, you've got a win-win situation where you can actually train young people to bring in that new technology and do it at a very inexpensive rate. And I think we should be pursuing those avenues.
And mesh technology can bring broadband at a low cost, to public housing.
I have a suggestion for maybe Pratt should think of doing a study, or someone here. The favelas in South America and a lot of other countries are economically viable communities. They're not necessarily safe because of the water and the health conditions, and the people who govern them are in fact the government that is basically prodding them to change and move, and there's always a lot of negative from the government, but they themselves have created viable communities, economically viable, socially viable. There's a lot of sharing, and I think, in a sense, someone should study those communities, and maybe the housing authority enclaves should in themselves make their own economy, and how that could, I think a study could be done that might come up with some interesting ideas for the housing authority's future.
If I could just say something. In all cases, though, we're talking about kind of mixing or changing the sort of isolated zoning that happens on those sites, right? We're talking about mixing in other programs, providing new space, whether that happens incrementally or that happens in a kind of one fell swoop. That becomes really kind of the essence what we're talking about. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to sort of locate a kind of new addition within a space that's the least inconvenient to the way that things are, or are we going to take advantage of what's possible in the sense of reshaping the way that these superblocks work? You know, just thinking about the notion of the surrounding community and its accessibility to those sites is, you know, is very restricted. There are very few ways that one can just simply enter into the site to pass through it if one wanted to. It's been designed in a way that it doesn't allow for that. And just in how even an incremental change is put into place could have a big effect on that. It could begin to break down those sort of barriers that have been in place now for 40, 50 years.
Because I find this question about the type of economic activity that could exist within NYCHA very exciting. And one of the things is that we've been looking at examples from the Midwest in which the NYCHA might be a perfect example because they're trying to create collectives, not quite publicly owned, but collectively owned. And it could be a really interesting model to begin to approach here, you know, how to think about bringing in these groups that are already doing things and giving them some sort of structure so that they can own those processes of manufacturing themselves or making.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question to try to bridge the questions of trying to build trust with the community as well as the role of the architect in trying to inculcate that trust. I feel as though personally what kind of gets lost in the discourse here is that the professional architecture, well, one of the main objectives is to project into the future of future spatial and defining future spatial possibilities. And with that, there's a huge portion of it where it's all about representations of that space through means like the picture that we've seen throughout this entire conference. So what I wanted to ask is, at this point in the discourse in New York City affordable housing, do you see the role of architecture and architects as being more about projecting into the future and provoking ideas from the community members, even if it is in the realm of concepts, or architects providing a professional service to implement these ideas that are coming from the community?
So I think Susanna answered this in a way by saying there's a what and a how. And one thing that I see has happened in the past too much is that we come with the how to a community and then ask for an opinion. And you know, there's very little that can be tweaked in these beautiful visions of the future. And so maybe we have to sort of start with, you know, a much longer and patient process of what, and develop the how together to a certain extent, and then let the architects as the experts sort of take that process. The other thing that I want to say to that, though, is, and it's kind of an answer to Daniel's question in the beginning, you know, which neighborhood would you have picked? And I kind of feel like it's the wrong question. What I see happening is that we don't have enough planning and design capacity in New York City neighborhoods, and so as we're throwing around sort of job options for NYCHA residents, I feel like our own profession is maybe one that we shouldn't forget, that this is something that we really need to start, you know, we have a mandate maybe to build that capacity in planning and design that we can have meaningful conversations with communities about the future and about affordable housing and what it might look like. That's, you know, I know there was an attempt early on in the planning of this event to maybe have it in a community center. And I think we all should try to do more of that, to not have this conversation amongst ourselves, but to have it with community members. And this language may not be the most easy to understand at the beginning, but we need to sort of start this conversation to bring more people out of the neighborhoods into the conversation about housing and the neighborhood.
Okay, one last question before we wrap up.
Do you ever think that like the stigmatization behind public housing causes residents of that housing to like stand back from being more involved in like participatory efforts, and if that like causes problems like I don't know, organizing? Or,
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
So do you find that residents are less involved or less invested in participatory programs because of the stigmatization of living in public housing?
Well, I just feel that in general, things that are brought up to the plate or plans that NYCHA comes up with, residents are not involved in it. So, excuse me, for instance, going back to the architect as well, First House is actually, we have someone rebuilding, actually did the gates pretty new because we didn't have an intercom in the beginning. Our first gate didn't have an intercom, so now we do. So that I can say that they did, reached out to leaders, community leaders, residents on that point. So I think overall, if NYCHA does that with residents in general, to bring their input in it, I think that will open up residents more, and they feel like they care and they have a voice. So I don't know if I answered your question, but so I think everyone in the community is a leader in general. I mean, we're different leaders in our own ways, but that's what makes us different and special.
I want to thank the panel, for this really great discussion. Just a couple of points to wrap up. I think, one, having planners and architects talk about this, new vision for NYCHA and how we go forward. And I think it's important that I like to talk about in what I call in terms of creating restorative human settlement, settlement that really allows people to be self-actualized, to reach their human potential. Because the important discussion is take it beyond building as object, but community as place. And I think this panel has really shown us a lot of the thinking that goes into that, and I want to thank them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Carlton and Meredith and Daniel and to all of our panelists and audience. I wanted to say a few of my favorite quotes from today, from Paula Siegel saying, "You can change the city," and giving ideas for what's the first step. From Killian just now, saying the total reset needs extra things. It's not just housing. From David Burney, the lower the budget, the more you need good design. And in general, I think what we've heard is 80-20 is only one idea. So thank you everyone for joining us in an inventory of what's possible.
So I think there are two reasons. One is the medium of the postcard. Have you ever written a postcard